Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us here at another Asia Society Roundtable. My name is Mason Richey, and we're happy that you're able to join us today for this discussion on extended nuclear deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. We have joining us today three absolutely tremendous guests, experts of the highest caliber. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and move into introducing them and then get us started on our roundtable discussion. In the first place, we have Han SungJoo. He is currently the chairman of the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies, and prior to that served as the South Korean foreign minister and the South Korean ambassador to the United States. He's also been acting president of Korea University, as well as a longtime scholar with appointments in the U.S. And in Korea. I would also note that he has, within the last few years, written two absolutely tremendous books, one called On the Brink, and another that just recently came out called Korea Triangles, which has been published by the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies. They're both tremendous works, and I would recommend any of our audience members to please purchase them and to read them. Secondly, we have with us Vipin Narang. Vipin is professor of international security at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His first book, Nuclear Strategy in the Modern Era, is, for me, one of the best books in the last 20 or 30 years on nuclear strategy.
Right. It's a cure for insomnia.
It's one that I've cited more times than I care to count in my own work. He is currently working on another book called Strategies of Nuclear Proliferation. His scholarly works, in addition to his monographs, have been published in the top journals in our field, including International Security, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, the Washington Quarterly, International Organization, and of course, he is a fellow at more think tanks than you can shake a stick at. So again, thank you to Professor Narang for joining us. And lastly, we have Dion Kim, who is the senior advisor for Northeast Asia and nuclear policy. Duyeon is also a fellow with the Center for New American Security and is my go-to person for all things involving North Korea, U.S. South Korea alliance, and in particular the way that the U.S. and South Korea interact to deal with regional threats and those on the peninsula. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and move into our discussion, and I'm going to start out with a very simple question, or at least one that is apparently simple and might actually contain some rather profound elements to it. And I'm going to throw this first question at Professor Narang. And that is very simply, what is extended nuclear deterrence? What is the logic of extended nuclear deterrence?
First of all, Mason, thanks for having me. Thanks for that overly kind introduction. It's great to be here with old friends, two people whose work I admire, and I learn so much about North Korea and South Korea and alliance relations from both Dion and Ambassador Han. So extended deterrence, as you said, sounds simple, right? It's when, primarily the United States offers to defend with its nuclear arsenal a formal ally and promises, to either retaliate against a conventional attack or a nuclear attack against that ally with its own nuclear weapons. Now, the United States is the only state that has what we call non-contiguous extended deterrence commitments. It has extended deterrence to its allies in Europe under NATO, including during the Cold War, West Germany, Italy. France opted out of the NATO extended deterrence structure to develop its own independent deterrent. We'll get back to why they may have done that in a second. But more relevant to East Asia, the United States extends deterrence to Japan and South Korea. And it sounds simple, but in practice, it's very difficult to achieve. Because the fundamental question is, how do you convince an adversary in the Korean Peninsula, let's say North Korea, that the United States is willing to use nuclear weapons on behalf of an ally. And the rub is not necessarily convincing North Korea of that, but convincing Seoul of that. And there's a nice top-line soundbite about extended deterrence. In extended deterrence, about 5% is deterrence and 95% is reassurance, convincing the ally that you will fight on their behalf. And there are multiple ways and methods that have been adopted over the years to try to make both the deterrent threat credible to the common adversary, but also the reassurance commitment to the ally, including deploying your own forces, which the United States does on the peninsula and has since 1950. Deploying tactical nuclear weapons on the soil of that ally. That's what the United States did with Germany and still does to this day. And it did with South Korea until 1991, until President Bush's Presidential Security Directive removed and downside American forward deployed tactical nuclear weapons. And that was with the consent of the South Korean government, largely with the consent of the South Korean government. There are various reassurance mechanisms that have been adopted, and most of them have been employed with South Korea. The most effective is if the United States has what Thomas Schelling called putting skin in the game, right? So having forces on the peninsula that would automatically, put American lives at risk if there was a conflict, and thereby convincing both South Korea and North Korea that the United States would respond in a conflict. And there are two wrinkles, I think, to extended deterrence, particularly the Korean Peninsula. One is the United States has always left it ambiguous as to the conditions under which it might use nuclear weapons on behalf of South Korea. It has that ambiguity helps deter North Korea, but it also allows the United States to decide when and how it might use nuclear weapons. So it's not necessarily automatic that the United States would use nuclear weapons in the event of a North Korean attack across the DMZ that was simply conventional. At the very least, I think the understanding is that the United States would extend deterrence if nuclear weapons were ever used against the ally. But it's unclear and intentionally left ambiguous as to whether nuclear weapons might be employed in the event of a conventional attack. The other wrinkle is that extended deterrence becomes very difficult once the common adversary is able to hold at risk the American homeland. This created during the Cold War what was known as the Bonn for Boston problem, or the Paris for Pittsburgh problem. And as the Soviet Union acquired an ICBM capability through the 1950s and 60s, it was developing, but later in the middle of the Cold War, U.S. allies became concerned that the United States would not fight a nuclear war on its behalf if the common adversary could destroy American cities and target the homeland. And this is, in fact, what led France to develop an independent nuclear deterrent. President Charles de Gaulle explicitly told President Eisenhower in the United States that the United States would never trade New York for Paris, and that France and France alone had to have an independent nuclear deterrent. Now, when North Korea tested an ICBM, in fact, today, I believe, here in the U.S., is the third anniversary of the second Hwasong 14 test, which for nuclear nerds is, we celebrate every ICBM anniversary. But once North Korea was able to successfully demonstrate the ability to hold at risk partially the U.S. homeland with the Hwasong 14, and I think the entire U.S. homeland with the Hwasong 15, this decoupling problem, whether the United States would trade Seattle for Seoul or San Francisco for Seoul, became acute. And it's reasonable now to wonder, especially with the Trump administration, which is trying to remove the forces from, the peninsula, forcing the South Koreans to pay more in terms of burden sharing. Its homeland is at risk with North Korea. How reliable is the U.S. extended deterrent commitment? So far, and I'll close with this, extended deterrence has been one of America's greatest non-proliferation tools. It has essentially kept most of Western Europe non-nuclear. During the Cold War, we forget that keeping West Germany non-nuclear was the fundamental problem and concern of both the Soviet Union and the United States. The United States went to extraordinary lengths, including nuclear sharing agreements with West Germany to prevent it from going nuclear. And if the United States extended deterrence commitment becomes or is perceived to be unreliable, either in Europe or in East Asia with Japan and South Korea, there's a real risk then that South Korea and Japan might consider developing their own nuclear weapons. I think in Japan it'd be a harder case because of public opinion, but in South Korea, we know Duyeon and Ambassador Han can correct me, Mason, you can correct me, but I think historically support for an independent deterrent South Korea, and I know there's some variation on, whether this could actually become possible, but 60-70% of the public tends to support an independent deterrent historically over time, and that's pretty stable. And so if the reliability of the American extended deterrent ever became questionable, there might be a lot of support for South Korea developing an independent nuclear deterrent. So I'll stop there, and if there's anything else I missed, just feel free to chime in.
Super. That's an excellent start. I'm going to then I think turn to Minister Han and Duyeon, and I think ask a sort of follow-on to that. Professor Narang has given us a description of the logic, the historical context, the effect of extended nuclear deterrence, both in general and with respect to South Korea and also to Europe for that matter. Mr. Han, you spent time in the government. You've seen the way that policymakers and the military here in South Korea think about extended nuclear deterrence in very practical terms. And Duyeon, you obviously have tremendous knowledge about the way that South Korean politics works and the way that South Korean approach to foreign affairs and to the alliance functions. Is there anything either particular in South Korea about how they understand the provision of extended nuclear deterrence by the U.S., or is there something that from your own frequent contacts with policymakers and people in government that can help us flesh out the reality of how extended deterrence is experienced by South Korea, either on the governmental level or on the more popular level?
Well, Vipin just gave a very good lecture on the subject, MIT level, and if I try to explain it to, say, my president on the issue, the simple logic that you're talking about is that in the absence of the extended deterrence, the potential aggressor, in this case, of course, North Korea, would feel free to provoke an attack, especially with nuclear weapons. Mainly, therefore, this extended deterrence exists in the form of what is generally known as nuclear umbrella. That is tit for tat. In the Korean case, the use of a nuclear weapon will require the approval not only of one president of the United States, but of the presidents of both countries. That is the understanding, and I think that is the legal situation, USA and South Korea. Also, in the case of Korea, the US military strategists have already indicated many times that the US and South Korea have the ability to obliterate North Korea even without using the nuclear weapons. So it may not be necessarily a nuclear attack versus another nuclear attack by our side. That is, we can deal with it, conventional advanced weapons. And so it's getting a little complicated, but certainly the short code word is that it is a strategy of tit for tat.
If I can just ask a follow-up to that, Mr. Han, you actually spent time, obviously, advising presidents. Do you, in your experience, have anything that you can tell us about the particular way that they respond to the logic of extended nuclear deterrence? I mean, is it something that is front of mind frequently? Is it something where they really understand a lot of the functional details of the way that it's supposed to work, or is it a sort of general concept where at the end of the day they hope that the U.S. extended nuclear deterrence for South Korea is credible and reliable, but they can't really know, and this is an enormous variable that keeps them up at night?
I guess a Korean leader would probably say that instead of giving us the extended deterrence, why don't they give the ability to use the means of the deterrence, which means a nuclear capability of our own. But no president has expressed that desire or preference so far. As you said earlier, public opinion polls sometimes indicate that South Koreans tend to prefer, whenever there is a crisis situation, we would like to have means of our own deterrence, which means nuclear capability. Therefore, I think our president, when the time comes when you can actually push the button or not, it will not be as simple as one would think. And in fact, there will be a lot of negative side in their thinking.
I think it's actually an interesting point that you make in your first set of remarks. I meant to comment on this earlier, that at least in theory, it doesn't only require the U.S. president to be willing to make this decision, but also in principle the South Korean president as well. Although I guess in practice, ultimately that decision does ultimately come down to that of the U.S. president, and that formally the South Korean president doesn't actually get a vote. And that's an interesting wrinkle as well. And I guess it's perhaps particularly acute here in South Korea, where, in principle, North Korea would be the target that you would imagine the U.S. would consider striking. And, given the fact that North Korea and South Korea, do ultimately see themselves as one people, would, seemingly, complicate the South Korean president's decision to, lobby the U.S. president to take that step. Duyeon, thank you so much for joining us. You want to weigh in on this? In particular, I'd like, you spent a lot of time talking with policymakers, with legislators, and with people who have contact in the government or in the government themselves. Again, I'd sort of like your take on, what your, average policymaker, either on the progressive side of the spectrum or on the conservative side of the spectrum, how they think about extended nuclear deterrence here.
Well, first, Mason and Asia Society, thank you so much for having me. This is an honor to be in such great company, including with you, Mason, who you are a go-to person for all of us as well. Vipin and Minister Han both laid out the issue in a very excellent way. I will try to maybe just tie the several points that they've made, tie them together, maybe kind of talk about, fill in some of the in between the lines type of issues. So, and this answers your question, Mason. In general, across the board, both across the ideological spectrum and professional, whether you're an expert analyst or a policymaker or a military official or a National Assembly person, a reoccurring theme that I hear is the issue of reliability versus credibility. And in most South Korean minds, whether they are pro-nuclear or not, regardless of that, there is a disconnect between, on the one hand, believing in U.S. capability, the capability of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence, but then psychologically and emotionally, there's a disconnect. And so psychologically, they question whether the U.S. really would come to South Korea's defense at a critical moment, especially when the homeland, the U.S. homeland, is at risk. And so that's, and this concern of the reliability part actually predates North Korea's nuclear weapons possession. This has vendors, and I guess, I mean, Minister Han would know better than I, but my understanding among many South Koreans is that this concern has existed since the end of the Korean War. And so, but it's just it's been exacerbated. The concerns have increased with North Korea's nuclear weapons capability advancements, and with, especially in today's context, what many South Koreans call the Trump factor, and concerns there with President Trump's public rhetoric of disdain towards U.S. allies being transactional and whatnot. And so that's one element. In terms of, this goes back to reliability. So in terms of U.S. response in certain scenarios, for many years and decades, most South Koreans that I've spoken to, and this ties in with the psychological element, they would like to hear and see and believe that the U.S. would respond with nuclear weapons to a North Korean attack or preemptive or any situation. And of course, that sounds alarm bells to Americans, because, and especially American policymakers and military officials, because for them, not every response has to be a nuclear one. Conventional weapons, whether it's things like precision-guided munitions, they can wreak just as much havoc, if not more, and do the job just as well. But this is where the psychological element comes in, because still, for many South Koreans, and this is actually North Koreans as well, the whole notion that nuclear weapon is the ultimate weapon, that's still ingrained in Koreans' psyche. And so this also plays out in U.S. South Korea Extended Deterrence Committee discussions, the bilateral channel that's been set up during the Obama administration to talk about these issues. And so that's one element. And it's not just among the policymakers, it's with the public as well. And so then what's interesting in today's context, again, just in the last maybe year or so, we hear in the public South Korean discourse among commentators and National Assembly people and others, and of course in private too, but the word nuclear sharing, so they're borrowing this from the NATO context. And we hear the word in Korean, they transliterate into Korean, they say nuclear sharing, we want that model, or they say we want the NATO model. And when we press a bit further and ask, so what about the NATO model do you want? They find the whole nuclear sharing arrangement, the NATO arrangement, to be very attractive. But then there's still some question amongst South Koreans about the details. So what exactly about that element do you want? Do you want South Korean pilots to be able to, to deliver U.S. nuclear weapons in times of need, or what? And there's no real answer there. But conceptually they like it. So again, it's a bit of a disconnect between the actual military capability versus feeling reassured, thinking reassured. And so on a final note, and I know we can dig deeper, Vipin mentioned a really important point, many important points. But if you look at the most recent nuclear posture review in 2018, it explicitly states that the U.S. would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend vital interests of the United States, allies, and partners. And this phrase for Americans and the arms control community in America raised a lot of eyebrows and concern, and this would raise concern among Americans' adversaries, because the NPR does explicitly say that defines extreme circumstances as being significant non-nuclear strategic attacks as well. But for allies, for American allies at South Korea, this is good news to them, because they want to hear, this is public reassurance that America would actually seriously consider attacking even under a conventional conflict situation. And so you've got, a double-edged sword here of, what does American policymakers say to reassure Americans and American adversaries and deter American adversaries, versus what do you say to America's allies and partners to make them feel reassured? And they're actually not the same talking points.
Great, thank you so much. I think you did exactly what you said you would do. You answered my question and you managed to tie together the comments from both Professor Narang and Minister Han. So thank you for that balancing act. And I think that you brought back, towards the end, something that Professor Narang, mentioned, extended nuclear deterrence is 5% deterrence and 95% reassurance. And, just sort of to give you the sort of background on why we're doing this particular talk today, over the last couple of months, I've had this discussion with a number of people here, experts, policymakers, diplomats from other countries, and sort of the cocktail hour question is, to what extent can South Korea rely on the US's extended nuclear deterrence? And, I can't say that there has not been a lot of skepticism about that. Because I think of the reassurance issue, and Trump obviously is a big part of that. So that's one of the sort of proximate driving factors in this discussion. Can I
jump in with one really quick? Duyeon made a really important point that I forgot to mention,
sure.
and it picks up exactly on what you just said. If I were South Korea, and if Trump gets reelected, I would be terrified of what the next 4 years would mean in terms of American extended deterrence and reliability. But if President Biden administration takes office in January, the United States will double down on the alliance. But there is this nagging question in democratic non-proliferation and arms control hands about no first use. And the language in the Obama nuclear posture review was that the fundamental role of U.S. nuclear weapons was to deter nuclear use against the homeland and its allies. And that left room for first use in an extreme conventional attack against both a U.S. and an ally. But there are efforts, and I don't know where they'll go, but the President Biden was supposedly one of the biggest, Vice President Biden at the time was one of the biggest proponents of no first use pledge during the end of the Obama administration. And watch out for this language on sole purpose. So if the language of sole purpose shows up and it's already in the Democratic platform, that the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear use against the United States or the homeland, or its allies, that excludes conventional attacks against the allies as a role for American extended deterrence. And so that cuts both ways, depending on, what you think and how reliable or important you think the first use, leaving open the possibility of first use is in terms of reassurance. So it's not simply the case that if there's a President Biden administration that there will be a reinforcement of the alliance, I have no doubt. And there will be a rapid effort to do that. But on nuclear weapons and declaratory nuclear policy specifically, it may come with sole purpose and no first use. So it cuts both ways.
Minister Han, I'm just going to pick up on that. Minister Han, how do you think the current Moon government would respond to a Biden presidency where the declared purpose of the U.S. Extended nuclear deterrence for South Korea would be a response to an attack on a nuclear attack on South Korea, rather than the current more vague wording that's in the current nuclear posture review?
I'm not privy to the thinking of the Moon administration, but Moon or not, any government, especially the government of America's ally, would be, I think, we continue to be uncomfortable with the continuation of the Trump administration, what with its lack of credibility, consistency, and the way their policy is predictable, the way it is unpredictable. And so the Moon we'll try to find a way to live with it. There have been some hitches along the way right now, but I am glad that I'm not the foreign minister of this country when Mr. Trump is the president, and people working around him who are having enough trouble themselves.
Great, thanks. So let me just come back then, and I'm going to circle back around to this issue of credibility, I guess, or to use a word with fewer syllables, trust. One way to talk about it, I think, is to ask, what are the psychological characteristics of the U.S. president? Is this a president who's willing to push the button, and under what circumstances? But another, I think, way of trying to look at it is to think about what the interests are of the provider of extended nuclear deterrence. I'm not saying that Trump would act in the national interest, the U.S. national interest. In fact, I'm fairly confident that in most instances he would do the opposite of that. But setting that aside for a moment, assuming a sort of normal president, if you will, what are the national interests that are served by a country, in this case the U.S., extending nuclear deterrence to another state? What does the provider get out of it, right? If it's apparently quite a significant leap to go from having a nuclear deterrent for your own country and your protection and deterrence of an attack against your own territory to providing that deterrent value for another state, namely an ally, and that's a big leap. What is it that the provider is therefore supposed to get out of it? I'm gonna put that first of all to Professor Narang.
Yeah, the great question. Two things. One is non-proliferation, right? So by extending deterrence to the ally, you prevent the ally from acquiring its own nuclear weapons. And following from that, it's actually, that's the primary benefit, because what follows from that is when you have a common adversary, the United States calculates it's going to be drawn into a conflict against a common adversary, regardless of whether the ally has an independent deterrent or whether the U.S. extends deterrence. So the U.S. would prefer to extend deterrence because Washington and Washington alone wants to make the decision about when nuclear weapons would be used and when escalation might occur. And, this is why the United States actually opposed French nuclearization in the 1950s. Washington was not happy about the French getting out of the barn and went to great lengths and offered President de Gaulle essentially what we had established with Germany, which was these extensive sharing agreements that would essentially nuclearize France in a war and allow their pilots and the president to decide when they might use nuclear weapons, but there would be a veto from the U.S. president. So it's as close to an independent deterrent as one can possibly get without having an independent deterrent. But there is this concern that de Gaulle had, which is it's not a French decision, an entirely a French decision about when it might use nuclear weapons. And it's that logic that drives the U.S. to persist with extended deterrence arrangements now for we're to 70 years, and it's largely to prevent the ally from acquiring its own nuclear weapons, and it doesn't want the ally to acquire its own nuclear weapons because it doesn't want the ally to start a nuclear war that it has to finish, and it wants to be able to control use and escalation decisions from Washington and Washington alone. So I think that's the primary benefit for the United States.
And how decisive is that logic and thinking among policymakers? I mean, I can understand why the military would think that way. Like they would think through a lot of that. I'm just interested in to some degree whether or not policymakers in the U.S. are really cognizant of those sets of positives, and in particular, whether or not those are significant enough to remind policymakers that they need to take this seriously, and that they need to extend the reassurance to their allies. Yeah, that's just kind of a question. I'm not neither here nor there.
I feel comfortable saying that every president until President Trump believed that, and believed it fundamentally. And I think most presidents after President Trump will believe that also. I think we're in this period now, though, that a lot of damage, frankly, can be done in 8 years, and you can unwind a credible and tight alliance as the U.S. and South Korea have had, for 70 years. Very, in a matter of I think 4 years can be waited out, but 8 years is very difficult. Duyeon and Minister Han may have additional thoughts on that, but I think it's been a general bipartisan consensus, and I believe it is until President Trump.
Yeah, I would completely agree with what Vipin said about American policymaker thinking and the political polities and the presidents. And so this is precisely where the South Korean concerns about the reliability concerns. And please, Minister Han, correct me if you have a different sense. But it seems like in South Korea, the insecurity, the anxiety has been accelerated because of Trump. It was always there, like I mentioned before, but it's been accelerated because of Trump. But even without a President Trump, there are many South Koreans here across the board in terms of their professional capacities who are concerned about this underlying current in the United States of wanting to look more inward and no longer be the so-called global police of the world in terms of non-proliferation and all that. And so I think the anxieties, the reliability concerns will still be there, but it really is the Trump factor. And like Vipin said, if Trump is reelected for another term, I think I suspect that in the notion or the interest for South Korea to acquire their own nuclear weapons, I don't think it will become mainstream so quickly, but I would expect, at least in private, even many of the progressive thinkers might begin to wonder, do we need to think of an alternative? Because in South Korean, I guess, psyche or mindset, there's no contradiction to them in between having confidence in U.S. Security commitments versus believing that their own country needs to find an independent way to protect itself, if that makes sense. And there's no contradiction there. Even if many people may be confident in U.S. security commitments, they still believe that their country needs to have their own independent way to protect itself too, as a sovereign state. And so I think this debate might continue to pan out if we do have another President Trump for the next 4 years.
Well, in that case, and I guess I'm just going to jump in there and come back to the trust question or to the credibility question, and I'm going to ask Minister Han a question that sort of speaks to his experience. As a former foreign minister, as a former ambassador to the U.S., what are the important criteria, especially diplomatically, for trust between two countries, especially in this case, especially the U.S. and South Korea, in an extended deterrence relationship?
I think it depends on the personal chemistry between the leaders, as well as the situation and the commitment itself, or the credibility of extended deterrence is based on, number one, on the situation, and number two, there's a verbal element in it. And any rational thinking or normal president of the United States, whether from the Democratic side or Republican side, would accept the strategic desirability of continuing with the extended deterrence, the issue of proliferation, to keep the trouble spots away from geographically from the United States, and keep alliance intact, and so on and so forth. But somebody like President Trump, Trump being Trump, he will ask, what's in it for us? How much are we getting out of it? And of course, if you become completely transactional and calculate the pluses and minus in terms of dollars, it will be very difficult to justify extended deterrence and its cost. And so I think starting with Mr. Trump himself, if he is reelected, he doesn't have to campaign for the next election. So he will be paying much less attention to the Korea issue, North Korean nuclear problems, and so forth. And so there will be, I think, renewed discussion on the issue of extended deterrence coming from all sides of the political spectrum. So this may be a little strange to talk about extended deterrence now, but I think actually a very timely and good time to talk about it.
Great. So we've got about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll be done. So we're bumping up against our time limit here. So I'll try to kind of move a little bit quickly here. I will say one thing, and that is it seems like if personal chemistry and relationships are important, it sounds like the U.S. should be extending nuclear deterrence to North Korea, at least if Bolton's correct that Trump thinks South Koreans are quote unquote terrible people. That certainly doesn't bode very well for the extended deterrence credibility. So Minister Han brought up something, and actually so did Dion as well, that I think we can now turn to, and that is, what are some of the potential crisis scenarios in which U.S. extended nuclear deterrence for South Korea could be tested? Obviously we're in a rough region here with North Korea and China, so there's a sort of geopolitical hotspot here in that regard. What are some of the scenarios in which that could be tested? Let's start with that, and I'll throw that out for anyone who wants to answer it.
Well, a crisis could come in a number of ways. It can start with a false alarm. It can come as a result of accidental occurrence. It could be result of a premeditated escalation, or a doomsday surprise attack. And with the kind of leaders we have in the United States for now, and North Korea, we cannot rule out any of these possibilities. But I think the most likely scenario that can lead to crisis would be some kind of a clash which leads to escalation, and ultimately not necessarily involving nuclear weapons, but larger amounts of arms and larger scale military involvement.
Great. Either of you two want to jump in on this?
I think Minister Han laid it out very well. Just to add one, I guess, more specific example, the other concern factor or reason for concern among South Koreans is President Trump essentially condoning allowing North Korea to continue to test short-range and medium-range missiles and not making that his red line, and only making ICBMs his red line. And so that also fuels a lot of this reliability concerns here in the South. And so if for whatever reason, in any of North Korea's future tests of either short and mid-range missiles, if an accident happens, whether it's closer to home on the Korean Peninsula or whether it's debris falling on Japan, and how the U.S. responds to that would greatly determine will be the ultimate test or proof of in South Korean minds and in Japanese minds of U.S. Security commitments.
Great. Professor Narang, let me just put that question to you then in maybe a slightly altered form. How is the U.S. nuclear posture here arranged in order to maintain extended nuclear deterrence for South Korea?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, the U.S. mostly relies on, for nuclear employment and deterrence, the SSBN force is basically, the capability we would rely on in the Pacific, and they'd be standoff. So, when the U.S. withdrew tactical nuclear weapons from South Korea in 1991, the idea was that the United States would essentially rely on, the SSBN force to extend deterrence. And I mean, I'll be very honest. The Trident 2D5.
Can I just ask you to explain to the audience what you mean by SSBN?
Not
Everyone might know what a ballistic missile is.
So the ballistic missile submarines, the United States has, I want to say, I'm going to get the number wrong now, but roughly 6 to 8 ballistic missile nuclear submarines, the Ohio class submarines in the Pacific Ocean, and then we have another complement in the Atlantic. And these carry the Trident 2 D5 submarine launched ballistic missile. And the Trident 2 D5 is the most capable, long-range, accurate, hard-kill capability that the U.S. has in its inventory. It's capable of essentially hitting any target on Earth within several minutes. There's this old belief that the SSBN force, the submarine launch force, takes a little longer to operationalize in a crisis, like 15 minutes to an hour or so, but that's no longer the case. Usually it's pretty responsive, and it can essentially hit any target in East Asia from anywhere a submarine might be patrolling in the Pacific. So it's a very credible and capable platform. There are other forms of extended deterrence and capabilities that the 2018 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review introduced. Specifically, I think, of relevance in these scenarios. One was one problem with the submarine launch force is it has very large warheads, and so in order to make the threat of employment more credible against, say, leadership targets or limited targets, the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review proposed a low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile, which I won't get into the details, but is about a third the size of the nuclear weapon that the United States used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about 5 to 7 kilotons. So it's more credible, and it is out. It's deployed at the moment, so it just entered service in the last several months. And there's also a proposal for a ship-launch cruise missile, and it's not clear whether it'll be underwater or surface ship. But those were specifically in service previously for the East Asia contingencies. So there are a variety of capabilities that the United States has in its inventory to make extended deterrence credible and capable. The issue with the United States is not capability, though. We can get into the various basing modes, and some are more advantageous than others. But the question is, like you said, trust and reliability. Does South Korea believe that the United States would ever employ nuclear weapons on its behalf in any sort of crisis or conflict with North Korea? And it's reasonable if I were South Korea, given the way President Trump has essentially shaken South Korea down over cash, and you don't do that to friends. And so you have to ask yourself, like, under what circumstances would this president ever employ nuclear weapons against his friend Kim Jong-un, on behalf of South Korea? And I think the trust element there is the real problem, not the capability. I will say one thing very quickly. When we talk about South Korea acquiring independent nuclear weapons, if it doubts the reliability of the United States, it is not the easiest thing, for South Korea to do that. It is a member of the NPT in good standing, which has signed the additional protocol. It has a robust civilian nuclear energy program, but reprocessing spent fuel for plutonium would be in violation of its agreements. And so it would either have to withdraw from the NPT, or would have to do so in secret, or have a hidden uranium enrichment program. I mean, it isn't legally the easiest thing for South Korea to do. Now, technically, it would be, simple and straightforward for South Korea to develop nuclear weapons. I like to joke a Samsung phone has more processing power than most American nuclear weapons. And so it's not a technical challenge, but there would be a legal hurdle that South Korea would have to cross, and it would take some time. And that's distinct from the Japanese case, because Japan has about 10 tons of reactor-grade plutonium on its own soil that's been reprocessed. So Japan is in a different position when it comes to being able to develop an independent deterrent than South Korea. And that time lag might be important, right? Because that might create a window of vulnerability for South Korea that Japan might not have if it decided to develop an independent deterrent. So I just want to mention that, because it's not just this, it's not an immediate, it wouldn't be an immediate shift from extended deterrence to an independent nuclear capability for South Korea. It would take some time. There would be some legal challenges for it too.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. If I may just add, so then the question could become, how do you strengthen that trust with that reliability? And so even though there seems to be a high level of confidence in the U.S. capability, and so this is where, based on my conversations across the professional spectrum and ideological spectrum, it has to do with things like what Minister Han was saying, the leader-to-leader chemistry, definitely, also public statements, public rhetoric by high-level American officials to reassure, declaratory U.S. policy, which, like I mentioned before, the declaratory policy could actually be very controversial in America and to America's adversaries, but very reassuring to America's allies. Other things are practical steps, like, when before Fire and Fury, or even, before Fire and Fury, when there was a lot of escalation, North Korea was testing a lot of nuclear devices and missiles and ICBMs, the U.S. beefed up its, so for example, they increased bomber flyovers, deployed strategic assets, things like that. And so that's something may not be visible to the naked eye, but if it's reported in the South Korean press, measures like that have tended to reassure the South Korean public in hearing and seeing that, yes, we've got all these, high weaponry deployed to the region. Yes, these are American weapons. Things like, what Vipin mentioned, the low yield weapons, that was good news for South Koreans and Japanese. Other things like, that whole debate recently where, where to deploy post-INF missiles, and, reports that Asia might be a candidate. Well, there have been, among many South Koreans who are concerned about this reliability question, and again, the psychology aspect of it, they would love to see it be deployed in Asia, because they want to see that, these types of weapons are physically in the region. And so, and then the final thing is, again, I guess linking this to, drawing parallels with the NATO model, there are many military officers and even defense strategists who would love to see South Korea have more say in the decision-making process. Of course, as Vipin said earlier, what is done with American nuclear weapons is solely, the decision of the U.S. president's weapons, and the military can't even have much of a say there too. But South Koreans would like to see at the most highest level as possible, South Korea, whether it's the highest general or even the president, be able to relay to the American president, under these scenarios and these circumstances, we would like to see such and such happen. Those types of discussions. And so I think there are some measures that can, be put in place, but it's always, it becomes another question of, the more you do, the more you reassure, there's always going to be South Koreans who want more, even more. And so then the question is, how much is enough?
It's an infinite appetite for reinsurance.
Yeah.
Of course. So we're pretty much out of time here. I wish that we could perhaps have a bit more of a discussion about low yield and whether or not that potentially causes instability that might be undesirable in the region, even if it through its increased warfighting ability, in theory, might actually support deterrence more. There's a sort of fine line, I think, there. And also a bit more of a discussion about what to do with the intermediate range, ground-based intermediate range missiles in a post-INF world. Unfortunately, we don't have time. Yeah, we clearly would need a part 2 for that, and maybe later in the year I can get the band back together and we can go on another tour. But I think I'll just close really with this quite simple question, which is really the one that is sort of motivated, I think, my desire to have this discussion today. And I'm going to start by putting it to Minister Han, and then I'll have both Vipin and Duyeon chime in at the end. Do you think that the criteria are still present for South Korea to trust U.S. extended nuclear deterrence? Yes or no, and sort of one sentence answer why or why not.
I think the trust is there, particularly on the level of military to military relationship. Let me just talk for about 30 seconds, closing my remarks. The model most often talked about in Korea, and I think in Japan by the experts, is the NATO-type nuclear sharing arrangement, which involves tactical nuclear weapons, usually loaded on NATO aircraft capable of handling nuclear weapons. Now, in the case of U.S. Korea alliance, the two countries will first have to decide and agree what kind of weapons, in this case, tactical nuclear weapons, will be available and in what form. And right now, there is no incentive, no personnel, no process to talk about, discuss these issues. And therefore, for the time being, we, those who are outside of the government, will think about it, talk about it actively, and wait for the governments, next governments in our countries to come in and take care of this very important issue.
Great, thank you very much. Vipin.
I would say you just have to wait 98 days and you'll find out, if South Korea can hold on until November 3rd, I think a lot will become clear after that. I think in any other configuration, I would say the next president would reinforce the alliance. But if Trump gets reelected, then, one has to adjust their expectations, especially for an unchained, unleashed President Trump in a second term. But if, Vice President Biden wins, I think there will be a lot of course correction and it'll happen very quickly. I do have this lingering concern about how much damage a lame duck President Trump can do just to mess up everything before President Biden comes into office. But I do think, and I have confidence, despite all the hand-wringing in the media, that our organizations and institutions in the United States would prevent him from doing the worst of things. I think the military, which is already slow-rolling a lot on, decoupling the alliance, would essentially make it impossible for him to do what he, anything too drastic. So I do have, small lingering concern about that lame duck period if President Trump loses, but it's not overwhelming. I have a lot of confidence in our institutions and organizations to do the right thing.
All right. So it's not dial a yield, it's dial a president. That's our, that's our answer to that. Duyeon, my friend, you get the last word.
Oh, very briefly, I think South Korea, Japan, the trust in the U.S. capability of its nuclear umbrella, Senate deterrence, it's there. but the public perception part, the reassurance part is where more work could be done.
All right, thank you very much. That was enormously economical at the end. So thank you for that. So I'm just going to say thanks to our three guests today on behalf of the Asia Society Korea, former Foreign Minister and Ambassador to the U.S. Han SungJoo, Professor Vipin Narang from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Dion Kim from the International Crisis Group. Thanks to each of you for sharing your tremendous expertise and experience with us today and with all of our audience members. And hopefully we'll be able to have future conversations with you as well when time permits. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye, everyone.